wonderful world of notes is on the air. Alongside the five-time champion and Golden Baton winner Kenny Blankenship, I'm Richard Long. And today, we have an incredible competition on the New Horizons in Music circuit, Johanna Beyer's Music of the Spheres. Beyer's course is fairly straightforward as it initially heads downhill, only to turn around and go right back up the slope on a grueling incline over the second half.
Yeah, this Beyer course can be divided into two halves, with the second half being basically a mirror image of the first half. Its uniqueness lies within the symmetrical design, although not perfect, shows an incredible sense.
Right you are, Ken. Traditionally, this competition is held featuring electronic instruments, but today we are in for a real treat as our competitors, in a bit of a nod to Beyer's first string quartet, will be on acoustic instruments. In fact, I can't think of a sanctioned Beyer event of this work that has been entirely acoustic.
Yeah, this one change will undoubtedly make for a unique experience today, Dick.
Right you are, Ken. A look at our competitors. On the inside lane in the number 1 bib is violinist Benny Page from the UK. Wearing number 2 on a second violin, and in blue is the wily American Corey Fica, who will be in the far right outside lane. And in all white, the Frenchman violist Michel Cloutier wearing the number 3 bib and in the center lane. What's going on here, Ken? They're not following the program.
This intro is actually written at the end of the score, and it clearly indicates...
Right you are, Ken. This percussion intro allows the competitors to get to their starting positions. What sounds are we hearing, Ken?
Well, Dick, the score calls for a lion's roar, but here we have a Super Bowl mallet being dragged along the head of a bass drum, and a few strikes of the triangle in a pattern that will be occurring throughout the course today. The Super Bowl bass drum mingling is an interesting combination to compensate...
Right you are, Ken. A wave by the heavily favored Cloutier to both people in the crowd. Fica digs into his starting block as the stoic Page readies himself. There we have the final chimes, indicating to get ready, and out of the noise, Cloutier jumps in front and sets a steady pace.
This is exactly what Cloutier wants, Dick. Look for him to continually set the pace with this two-note figure, a classic 0-1 set. Expect the others to jockey for position on iterations of this same figure.
Cloutier shows a simple, easy gliding motion between F and E with a perfect form. Benny Page, up a few octaves, is mimicking Cloutier while augmenting his motion as they make their way through the first triangle markers. Holding on to a high F, Page appears ready to strike. Page is moving beyond the oscillating F and E and embarking on something new. What is Page doing?
Well, Dick, Page appears to be developing an 8-note theme on that half-step interval. We'll have to listen carefully to how Page and Fica utilize this material to defeat the Frenchman, who is subtly ramping up the tempo.
Right you are, Ken. Cloutier chugs along as Fica is a full beat behind and clearly following in Page's footsteps on an augmented version of the theme Page has established. Meanwhile, Page is making a move but on some new material. Where does this idea come from?
Well, Dick, I don't know.
Well, thanks a lot, Ken. You're a lot of help. Oh, that was an E-flat. What is Page thinking?
Yes, Dick. Unless he can really work at that, E-flat might come back to haunt Page in the wake of Cloutier's steady F and E.
Right you are, Ken. The trio is now barreling downhill and picking up speed like a runaway freight train. And as they do, they are steadily and continually getting louder. Fica, on the outside, has latched on to that first and clearly primary theme while keeping a safe distance behind the other two. Page is now combining the two themes into one longer theme.
A masterful stroke, Dick. Right when we pass the fourth marker, indicated by those triangle hits, Page ties everything together to slip by Cloutier and take the lead.
A half step of the primary theme, followed by a whole step from the secondary theme, and Page finds himself out front, with the Frenchman hot on his heels and the plucky American rounding things out.
I expect Fica to make a move soon, Dick. This far, he's opted to draft behind the others on the primary theme.
Right you are, Ken. Page keeps his lead as the trio reaches the turning point with a tempo and dynamic plateau. Page returns to the mimicking augmented F and E. Fica glides along with his offbeat stride. A rapid batch of the triangle markers signifies that we've reached the turnaround. And out of the corner, Corey Fica has somehow taken the lead. The American is now cruising backwards, and Page quickly falls in line to make the retrograde transition as well.
I think we may have to go to the board, Dick. It appears that Fica dropped a note and cut the corner in order to take the lead.
Fica has been the most penalized performer on tour, and it seems he will likely face another one today. With 6 lengths to go and all uphill, Fica attempts to pull away, but Page and Cloutier stick to their game plans and easily keep up with the American.
What's incredible about this Beyer event is that the pitch, tempo, and dynamic all feature the glissando, an idea champion by Henry Powell.
Right you are, Ken. Out of the next set of triangle markers, Paige on the secondary theme makes a low move to skirt around Cloutier in its second. Paige even nails the E-flat to propel him ahead and ensure that note is an integral part of the work. About those triangle markers, Ken, they don't seem to be at regular intervals.
Well, Dick, they appear to be falling right along the Fibonacci sequence, and Page has thus far coordinated his attack to each of these markers. We may have to dig in further into this during the post-game review.
After passing through each of the triangle markers, Page begins one of the three themes anew, and thus far the tactic has been working quite well for the Brit. Our trio has slowed down quite a bit as they tire and labor along the final stretches. Fike is first to reach a triangle marker signifying the final leg. Page and Cloutier follow closely. Sliding from E to F, Fike gets stripped up. Down goes Fike. Cloutier deftly evades any contact and continues his pace into the final stretch, while Page leaps to an incredibly high F to avoid getting entangled.
Cloutier's unflappable focus shows why he is a world-class violist.
Right you are, Ken. Page, now on the lead, attempts to regain his footing as he pirouettes and adds another primary theme now in its original form. Fike gets back up and follows in Page's footsteps, only well behind.
Fike may very well have gotten tripped up here because of his dropped note earlier, wreaking havoc on his pacing over the entirety of the course.
Right you are, Ken. Cloutier steadily pushes along. It's neck and neck, folks. Page concludes the theme and eyes the finishing line as he slowly enters the final triangle markers. Fike can't quite complete the primary theme and can only gasp on that G sharp. With a steady hand, Cloutier is finishing strong and makes a final move as Page attempts one last leap to a high F, hoping to break the finishing line. But the crafty Frenchman pulls ahead and into the winner's circle on his final four steps. Oh, what a finish! What a finish!
Well, Dick, Cloutier once again demonstrates that sticking to a game plan, no matter how simple, is a surefire way to success. Every motion in this Beyer event had purpose and direction.
Right you are, Ken. The results again are Michel Cloutier with the win, Benny Page in second, and Corey Fike rounding out the podium. Join us next month when Bobby Corno and the New York Mills Philharmonic look for redemption in a rematch against Haile Gedankazong. For Kenny Blankenship, I'm Richard Long, and you have been listening to New Horizons in Music Appreciation on the Wonderful World of Notes Network.
Welcome to the post-game report. I want to start off with some acknowledgments with the recording. Benita Zhirkova, who played violins 1 and 2, Mitchell Cloutier on viola, and Corey Fike played all of the percussion parts. I wanted to put together an acoustic recording because in source after source, they kept citing that the piece was written for 3 electrical instruments or strings. Unfortunately, I could not find a recording on acoustic instruments, only electrical instruments. And I figured, why not make a one-of-a-kind recording? Recruited a few players, recorded on 2 separate dates, one in the percussion studio at Frost School of Music, and the strings were recorded in my kitchen. Johanna Beyer was born in Germany, immigrated to the United States in 1923. During the 20s and 30s, her life and career intertwined with American modernist composers that she studied under and worked alongside, such as the Seegers, Henry Cowell, John Cage, amongst others. Her compositions are characterized by an economic approach to the material, balanced forms, and experimentation, and Music of the Spheres fits that description. She died in 1944 of ALS. Music of the Spheres was written in 1938. So to get a little context, I looked at other things that were happening in the world in 1938. From the visual arts, I have shared an engraving by M.C. Escher called Sky and Water. In the upper right, a self-portrait by Frida Kahlo. And on the bottom, Pablo Picasso's Maya with a Doll. 1938 was a tumultuous year during an uncertain time. Germany and Italy each passed many anti-Semitic laws. Meanwhile, here in the United States, Benny Goodman, a Jewish band leader and clarinet player, became the first jazz musician to perform at Carnegie Hall. Back to Europe, Hitler annexed Austria and the Sudetenland, a large portion of Czechoslovakia. Perhaps my favorite, though, is the famous or infamous radio play performance of War of the Worlds by Orson Welles. I want to get through the thematic content pretty quickly, since much of it was covered in the broadcast. The initial idea that we first hear in the third instrument is a half step. F, E, F, E, F, E, and that goes throughout the entire piece. The primary theme consists of 4 pairs of half steps, making it very easy to see the relationship to that initial idea. The secondary theme consists primarily of whole step pairings. The primary and secondary themes have very little to do with one another. They are both 8 notes long, start on F, and the 6th and 7th notes of their sets are C and B flat. It isn't until the developed theme enters that we see a relationship between the primary and secondary themes. As mentioned in the broadcast, the developed theme consisting of a half-step pair from the primary theme, followed by a whole step pair from the secondary theme, and so on and so forth. Here we have a look at the primary and secondary themes in the score. Primary theme encircled in red, secondary theme encircled in blue. Now the primary theme, as we see here, is performed by both of the upper voices, but voice number 2, it only performs the primary theme. Instrument number 1, however, performs the primary, the secondary, and the developed theme. Looking further at the thematic content, the primary theme is heard in voice number 2 always at an augmentation, twice in duration, as the primary theme heard in voice number 1. And we see the developed theme in context with the primary theme in voice number 2, developed theme circled in green, half step, whole step, half step, whole step by those pairs. As stated in the broadcast, every time voice number 1 enters with a statement of one of the themes, it only occurs after the pair of triangle hits. It's as though the triangle is acting as a marker to say, okay, and new theme. Beyer develops the themes through a variety of means: augmentation, rhythmic displacement, retrograde, and glissando. Looking at the score sample, we see the augmentations straight away. The O1 set begins F-E, F-E in voice number 3. It's on quarter notes. That is then repeated and popped up a few octaves in voice number 1, but augmented to half notes. When the primary theme first begins in voice number 1, it is augmented again, twice as long as before, now in whole notes. And then when it's iterated for the first time in voice number 2, it is augmented another time to double whole notes. So this augmentation takes us from quarter, half, whole, double whole. As soon as voice number 2 enters, we have rhythmic displacement. Throughout the first half, the second voice is always entering with a new note on beat 2 of a measure. It's as though it's trying to keep up to voices 1 and 3. Then, in the second half, voice number 2 is always ahead of the beat. It's always entering on beat 4 of a measure, as though it has somehow leapfrogged voices 1 and 3, who are now struggling to keep up with voice number 2. Before I talk about retrograde, I am going to comment on Beyer's use of glissandi. As stated in the broadcast, Henry Cowell considered glissandi applicable to music parameters other than pitch. For example, hairpins indicating an increase or decrease in dynamic over time would be a glissando of the dynamics. In the case of music of the spheres, glissandi are incorporated in the accelerando and ritardando of the tempo, as well as the long, subtle dynamic crescendo and diminuendo throughout the work, of course, along with all of the glissandi of pitch. Retrograde first occurs in voice number 2, not on the primary theme, but on that initial idea of that F and E. But instead of being F, E, F, E, it is E, F, E, F, whilst the others are oscillating on F, E. After the turnaround, then both voices 1 and 2 retrograde the thematic material that was heard in the first half. So we get a complete mirror image. That line of symmetry occurs throughout that second half to what occurred in the first half. Looking into further detail with the retrograde, well, first let's look at those retrograde sets. There we go. First we'll take a look at the retrograde primary theme here in voice number 2. It actually starts on a B flat, then C, B, A flat, so on and so forth. As the primary theme concludes into the turnaround, in voice number 2, it is an A, and yet it starts on the retrograde on a B flat. Why is this? I don't know. I can only give well-educated guesses. The first of which that popped into my mind was that Beyer did not want to have an A in both of the upper voices occurring at the same time, and then only to go to a B flat and having that overlapping, just too much overlapping occurring. However, we see later on that there is quite a bit of overlapping with notes in those upper voices, so I have a hesitancy about that. In voice number 1, we see the retrograde primary theme in full, and then the beginning of the retrograde developed theme. Continuing on, we have the retrograde developed theme circled in green, and the retrograde primary theme returns, circled in red. In voice number 2, we see the retrograde primary theme occurring throughout. And finally, encircled in blue, the retrograde secondary theme. In structuring music of the spheres, Beyer utilizes a mathematical approach. There's a symmetrical form and the Fibonacci sequence. I'm going to start with a symmetrical form. Looking again at M.C. Escher's Sky and Water, we can look at it and clearly say that this image has symmetry to it. However, it is not a strict or perfect symmetry, as the birds are clearer and clearer the further up we get, and the further down we get, the fish become clearer and clearer. Like M.C. Escher, Beyer's symmetry is not a strict symmetry. Going through the piece as a whole, the intro measures 1 through 6. The instrument 3 oscillates on F and E in quarter notes. Now, the first half of this symmetrical form really begins at measure 7, and it goes to measure 53, with a constant increase in the dynamic, an increase in the tempo throughout. Then we have 6 measures of stability. The entire trio is oscillating on F and E. The back half of the symmetrical form, all of the themes are in retrograde, while the dynamic and the tempo steadily decrease. This goes from measure 60 to measure 106. After which there is a 6-measure interlude. on the introductionary material. All voices, again, oscillating on F and E. Measures 113 to 120, the lead voices recap that primary theme in its original form, no longer a retrograde. Finally, measures 121 through 127, we have our ending. Predominantly, we are on F and E oscillating, and that is on voices 1 and 3. Voice number 2, though, it's stuck on that primary theme. As mentioned in the broadcast, seemingly gasping on that G sharp, never completing the primary theme. Here I have mapped out instrument 1 into looking at that symmetrical form with each of the themes that occur. So in red, we have all versions of the primary theme. And in blue, the secondary theme, which is only heard once in its original form, and then, of course, once it is a retrograde. Same thing with the developed theme in green. Once it is heard in its original form, and once it is heard as a retrograde. So the themes in their original order, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 little sections, and each section begins right before they begin with, as mentioned earlier, those triangle hits, as though it's marking, hey, we're at this moment now, new theme. So the themes occur in their original order, then we have that turnaround, and then the themes are in retrograde for that same amount of time. And put all that together, it's symmetrical. However, the form as the whole piece, though, there's a bit more, as we can see at the end of this, 3 more sections there, after the symmetrical form in instrument 1 than there was at the beginning. There's just 6 measures at the beginning before the symmetrical form, whereas at the end, it's 20 measures. Moving on to the Fibonacci sequence, I'll lay it out here, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, so on and so forth. Beyer utilizes the Fibonacci sequence in a variety of ways. Obviously, in measure 1, voice number 3 enters. In measure 3, the lead voice, instrument 1, enters. Instrument number 2 enters in measure 8. Well, what about 5? Well, measures 5, 13, 21, and 89 all mark entrances of the short triangle phrase, a quarter note followed by a dotted half note, and played twice at each entrance. When each of the triangle phrases concludes, instrument 1 begins a new iteration of one of the themes. Now, measure 55 is the back half of the triangle phrase, and part of the climax to the whole piece, the fastest tempo, the loudest dynamic from measures 51 to 59. Matching this climax, the triangle plays its phrase 3 successive times with entrances at 54, 56, and 58. So even though the triangle does not enter at 55, it is heard. Like Beyer's use of symmetry, she is not strict in her use of the Fibonacci sequence. As noted earlier, 55 is not at the beginning of a triangle phrase, and nothing new or different really occurs in measure number 2. Now, the Fibonacci sequence goes a little bit further than that as well, because the second half of the piece being symmetrical to the first half, what we get over the first half is the ascending Fibonacci sequence, and the second half, with all the retrogrades occurring, we get a descent of the Fibonacci sequence. In conclusion, Music of the Spheres incorporates ideas and principles utilized by other artists creating works around the same time as Beyer. The form of the work takes shape through a symmetrical design and draws from the Fibonacci sequence. By not strictly adhering to convention, Beyer toys with the listener's expectations throughout the piece. We have become accustomed to hearing phrases in 4 or 8. And even though 8 is found within the Fibonacci sequence, utilizing the Fibonacci sequence as a whole helps to break up those entrances or phrasings, ideas in 4s and 8s. And Beyer utilizes an economic approach with a limited palette of material, with each of the themes being tied together. The primary theme, of course, is intrinsically tied to that initial idea of a half step. Primary theme consists of 4 pairs of half steps. The primary theme and the secondary theme are tied together in the developed theme, which combines the primary and secondary theme. I thank you for tuning into this post-game report of Johanna Beyer's Music of the Spheres.